All right, welcome back to Omega Matters. We are going to do an AUA today, an Ask Us Anything episode. So we have collected some questions from all you guys, and we're excited to go through them. There's definitely some categories and areas where a lot of people are interested in what mostly Dr. Harris thinks about what's going on with C15 and dry eye and bleeding and all that. So we're going to kind of go through them in categories and see how far we get. You ready?
Ready to go.
To answer some questions?
Let's do it.
All right. We are going to start with Carol D. And she asks, could Dr. Harris please address the role of pentadecanoic acid, C15? There seems to be a lot of emerging evidence showing that it's superior to omega-3 fatty acids, and one's health could benefit by replacing daily supplementation of omega-3 with C15.
Yeah, I'm not sure there's emerging evidence. There's certainly emerging noise about that. I will actually do a nutrition talk in the near future, mid-September, I think we'll record that, specifically looking at all the data on C15. And I can pretty well summarize it by saying that there is some evidence that higher levels of C15 is pentadecanoic acid, penta is 5, or pentadeca is 15, right? It's a saturated fatty acid. It's pretty much in the human diet from dairy fat. It's actually made in the mammary gland of the cow from bacterial derived substrates. And C15 and C17 is the other one, that's called margaric acid for some reason. In any event, those two odd chain fatty acids have been getting attention, mostly C15. It's driven by some association studies. This is associated with that, which is fine. It's certainly not definitive. It doesn't mean one's causing the other. It just means they're associated. A dolphin researcher named Stephanie Van Watson is the one that's been pushing it, and he's formed a company with her husband, the Fatty 15, to market this thing. I think again, the evidence, I guess, from association studies, there's a little bit of evidence from animal feeding studies. There is one paper that is just one of these studies where you sort of drizzle fatty acids on top of cells in a petri dish and see what happens. And there were lots of cells in those different petri dishes that got tested by sprinkling C15 or sometimes EPA, but no other fatty acids. And then there's a lot of inferences drawn from what happens to those cells. And there's one human feeding study that shows that if you feed people C15, their blood levels of C15 go up, which is not a big surprise. Yeah. Sort of like adding blue watercolor to a glass of water and it turns blue. Sort of that level of excitement. So anyway, that's not a surprise. There's a lot of hype about this, and it's certainly not been shown to be an essential nutrient, not by a long shot. It may be bioactive, but that doesn't mean it's essential. And those are different terms. So we'll dig more deeply into that, but the claims right now are the science is very thin for what's really needed is a randomized placebo-controlled trial giving C15 versus a placebo to people with certain diseases and see particularly metabolic syndrome, which is what they seem to make all the noise about, and see if it actually corrects blood glucose, serum triglycerides, HDL cholesterol, blood pressure, these other factors that are part of the metabolic syndrome. If that works, great. That data has not been produced yet. So right now it's a nice idea, worth testing, but it's certainly not ready for prime time.
Yes. You've mentioned it's really, they're targeting the outcomes are the metabolic syndrome, insulin resistance. That's where C15 is showing up. And we've also seen that in some of like force papers looking at the dairy related fatty acids. And there's a relationship, typically a good one, between dairy related fatty acids and metabolic syndrome. But those studies need to be done.
Right.
So we are a fatty acid testing company. We have a complete test with 24 fatty acids. Why is C15 not on that list?
Partly because it's a very, very tiny fatty acid when measured in the blood, very low levels. Number two, it's not got enough evidence behind it at this point to be actionable. We don't even know what a healthy target level is. Then Watson and her group have suggested a target, but it's just a suggestion. It hasn't got good evidence behind it. And it's a more complicated, actually, fatty acid to measure in the blood. It requires some more instrument time, and so it would be a little more expensive to do if it was actually offered. So once we are convinced that it really means something, we may add it to our list on the complete fatty acid profile.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So it's something we can measure. It's something we do in research studies, but it is not a part of our standard clinical runs. So it's there's a big kind of process issue for us. So that I think covers a lot of there are like about 5 other questions about C15. There's kind of in these questions, there's kind of a connection between C15 and omega-3, like C15 is better at raising omega-3s. Maybe that's a confusing
I've not
point.
seen that data. That could easily be garbled from marketing talk. There's one paper where they drizzled fatty acids on top of cells in culture, and they compared EPA to C15 in a variety of these cells, and claimed that EPA didn't do as well as C15. Therefore, it's more healthy for you than EPA, which is a huge leap in logic. Well, I won't go into it. But anyway, that's the reason. And then it gets turned into marketing as EPA is not as good as C15.
Yeah. The game of telephone starts to have an effect.
Oh, yeah.
And I guess on the dietitian side of things, these are fatty acids present in whole fat dairy, whole milk yogurt, things like that. And I guess the idea is the supplement is a much more concentrated dose of these fatty acids without getting all the other saturated fats from the dairy. But if you are consuming any whole fat dairy, you're getting some of these fatty acids. And there's a lot of other things in dairy that are good for us and bad for, depending on your situation. So it's just, you're likely getting some of this in the diet if you have any kind of dairy fat in your diet.
Right. And I think that's part of the problem is these are markers of dairy fat intake. And there are, as you said, there are many other nutrients that come along with dairy, full fat dairy products. And maybe some of those are what's beneficial and not the fatty acids. And the fatty acids is just a marker of the intake of those kind of fats. Could be calcium, could be something else in the product. So until further research, stay tuned. But I would keep my wallet closed for now.
So if you want to see a more thorough breakdown of all the studies that have been cited on C15, do tune into the nutrition talks on C15 coming up in September. So next group of questions is about A-Fib, atrial fibrillation. And this is another topic that we have done a nutrition talks on. So you can go ahead and check that out for the more of a deep dive, but we'll cover some of that here. So should someone with A-Fib that's controlled and taking Eliquis be okay eating quality salmon roe? Asks Debbie L.
Well, Debbie, that's a unique question. So someone who has controlled atrial fibrillation, and they're drugs that can be used to control it, and they're on Eliquis, which is a blood thinner, and people who have A-Fib are usually on a blood thinner because one of the big risk factors, big problems with A-Fib is that you can develop a blood clot in the upper chambers of the heart that can be pumped up into the brain and cause a stroke. So if you want to be anticoagulated, and that's what Eliquis is doing. And so she asked if she can really take omega-3. She's talking about salmon roe, okay, but fundamentally she's asking, should she take omega-3? Is that okay? And I would say, yes, it's okay. Maybe a gram a day. EPA DHA is a very reasonable 1,500 milligrams maybe. Would be a very reasonable intake. I don't know how much salmon roe she's talking about, but the general idea is,
right.
You can take, what I would not do if I had A-Fib is take 4 grams a day of EPA.
Yeah. And also, we are not your doctor, and you need to get your medical advice directly from your doctor.
Thank you.
But
Thank you for
general,
reminding me of that. Right.
Also, kind of in general, when you're talking about dietary intake of omega-3s from fish, salmon roe, those doses are much, much, much lower than a consistent gram a day, 2 grams a day of omega-3. It's a lot harder to get that in the diet. So you're a lot less, it's harder to overdo it, doing it through the diet. So eating fish and being on a blood thinner shouldn't be an issue. It's just much lower doses. Right. So this is sort of related, and we haven't talked about this, but what are your thoughts about the risk of ventricle fibrillation with supplemental omega-3? And is there omega-3 index related with higher risk for ventricle fibrillation?
Yeah,
this is from David G.
Let's go back and do that again. It's ventricular fibrillation.
Oh, yes. Ventricular. Okay, here we go. Take 2. All right. What are your thoughts about the risk of ventricular fibrillation with supplemental omega-3? And is there an omega-3 index associated with the higher risk? That is a question from David G.
Yeah. Good question, David. In fact, much of the 1990s was spent trying to see if omega-3s could reduce risk for, we'll call it VF, ventricular fibrillation. Much more serious than atrial fibrillation. Ventricular is the lower chambers of the heart. Atrial is the upper chambers. And if the lower chambers go into a fibrillation or a irregular, uncontrolled beating, that can essentially kill you almost immediately. That's called sudden cardiac death. And the original observations on omega-3 were that when given to people with heart disease, they reduced risk for sudden death. And there were animal studies that had been shown that reduced risk for ventricular fibrillation was an effect of omega-3. Now, it's not really been strongly confirmed. It certainly doesn't increase risk for VF, that's for sure. But whether it really is a good treatment for VF or prevention of sudden cardiac death is a little bit unclear at the moment. There's no risk involved. But whether it's really effective in preventing VF has not been nailed down completely.
Okay. This last question that's kind of technical. It's not about any kind of fibrillations. This is about actually ApoE and Alzheimer's risk. So this is about a precision nutrition study in 2021 recommended greater than 2 grams a day of DHA for ApoE4 carriers for Alzheimer risk reduction. Some 2024 studies show increased risk for A-Fib at that dose. What would you recommend in this case? That's from Elaine C.
Yeah, I don't think that you really have an increased risk for A-Fib at 2 grams a day of EPA and DHA. That really hasn't been shown. And so, but nor are we really absolutely sure that taking that amount of EPA DHA is going to slow the development of Alzheimer's. We have some association studies evidence of that, and there's a little bit of randomized trial evidence for that, and it's safe to do, so I would do it, and I am doing it. I'm taking about 1.5 grams a day of EPA DHA. which is for most people enough to get up to that 8% target value. And that's the level that should be good for reducing risk for developing, particularly people with ApoE4 carriers. It should slow, I mean, you can't stop the development of cognitive decline. What you can do is slow it.
Yeah, that's very good. There's a lot of this stuff can get kind of confusing, so that is a good clarification. Did you want to flip over and do some of the diet questions?
Oh, sure, yeah.
Miscellaneous ones?
I can ask you
Is
a
that what you
question.
wanted to do?
Yeah, let me see if I got some nice diet questions here. I got to get some of this out of the way. So let's see. Here's a question from Catherine C. When selecting fish oil supplement, should we take into account the optimal EPA and DHA content, kind of the ratio of EPA and DHA? She works in a fertility clinic, tries to get people to get higher EPA, higher DHA levels, interested in learning the latest evidence, how you can customize supplements based on results such as the omega-6, omega-3 ratio. So what would you have to say to Catherine about that?
Yeah, this is something we get asked about a lot. There's a couple ratios that she's mentioning here, which is part of the confusion. But if we're looking at EPA and DHA, those are both included in the omega-3 index. So typically, we are focused on getting more of both EPA and DHA, and both of those will raise the omega-3 index. And so more recently, there's been interesting studies on what EPA is better at doing and DHA is better at doing in the body. Kind of in general, we see DHA being really important for pregnancy and brain-related outcomes, both in young life and in aging. And then EPA seems to be more effective relating to cardiovascular health and inflammation, but both together you can get really nitpicky about those things, but typically we just recommend getting enough of both. And so when it comes to the omega-3 index, it's going to just give you the combined value. You can see the different values in the complete report if you want to look if your DHA or EPA is kind of making up the most of that omega-3 index level. The DHA typically is 70 to 80% of the ratio or of the omega-3 index. Right. So usually DHA is higher in kind of normal settings. They can be about 50-50 when someone's taking high dose EPA. So that's when you're going to see that, but typically it's mostly DHA. And the omega-6, omega-3 ratio is something kind of completely different from that question. And we're looking at the omega-6 levels in the blood versus the omega-3 levels in the blood. And really the main thing to know about that is if your index is, if your omega-6, omega-3 index is very high, that means you have either high omega-6 or low omega-3. We always just say focus on the omega-3 side. And that means usually taking more omega-3 raises omega-3 levels. But again, it's both EPA and DHA. So you can do a little bit of tinkering depending on what you're looking at, getting a little higher EPA or a little higher DHA in your supplement. But in general, having a higher dose of both is where we see that's the most important thing to focus on.
Yeah, when studies have been done comparing EPA and DHA directly, pure, same amount of each, in people with metabolic syndrome or obesity and inflammation, actually the DHA on a gram for gram basis is more effective at raising the omega-3 index than EPA is. And actually, there are some inflammatory markers that are reduced more by DHA than EPA. And the triglycerides are reduced about the same. Cholesterol to HDL ratio is improved more by DHA than EPA. So there's some good evidence that DHA is good for heart health as well. That's why I think, like you said, we recommend both of them being elevated. So eating both EPA and DHA is important.
Yeah. Yep. You can get too lost in the weeds and it's better just to keep it simple and get both in the diet through fish or supplementation. And the hyper specialization is really just for a very select, probably, group of people. And for most of us, just taking regular fish oil works really well for a lot of these things that people are worried about.
Yeah. So another question from Karen B. Are omega-3 eggs a healthy option? Do they have ALA in them? Which she says may be unhealthy. I don't understand the unhealthy part. But is it because they're ALA rich or DHA rich?
I don't know. Maybe it's the polyunsaturated fat might be oxidized kind of question.
Could
That's
be.
Another person asked something along that, so we could kind of touch on that. Omega-3 eggs are a healthy option, especially if you have very low intake. You can get, I think the highest I've seen is like 70 milligrams of DHA and EPA in an egg or two, something like that. It's going to be a much lower dose than fish or fish oil, but it's not nothing. And they can get eggs pretty enriched. I think the limiting, if they give the chicken omega-3 in their diet, like fish or roe or whatever,
You mean
so they can give it in their diet.
DHA and EPA, not ALA.
Yeah. If they're giving EPA and DHA, giving the chicken ALA to eat is not really going to change the DHA and the EPA levels. So it is important to look at the egg carton and see if it says a specific amount of DHA or EPA. Usually it's DHA present in the egg.
Right.
It is not always very easy to tell. It probably will be on the front of the package and not on the supplement facts panel. It's my guess, which I don't love. And it is hard. I've looked before. It's been a while, and I had a hard time deciphering like how much was in each egg. But I know they can be pretty well enriched because we've measured eggs here from local farmers, and they can get really high. The eggs can start to smell like fish if it gets too high.
Yeah,
so that's like a limiting issue. There's a really good study by Susan Carlson with pregnant women where they used omega-3 eggs to raise blood levels of EPA and DHA in pregnant women who really weren't going to eat fish, and just like an easy option. And it also has choline, which is a great nutrient with omega-3s. So it's been used in studies. It can work, but in the marketplace, it's very it's not very clear how much you're actually getting. So it's not a great thing to depend on, but it's possible to get the omega-3s.
What's the price differential?
I have no idea.
Okay. More
because egg prices have been all over the place as of late anyway. So usually it's a higher end egg. It's not going to be like a standard egg. It's those specialty eggs.
Good.
The ALA, they can be given ALA, flaxseed and whatnot, and raise ALA levels. And I don't see any issue with that at all. And the question of whether or not ALA is unhealthy is interesting. ALA is actually an essential nutrient, an essential fatty acid. And so we need it for our bodies to function. It is a polyunsaturated fat, which has a lot of double bonds, which means that they can be oxidized. Do you want to talk about this general fear of eating PUFAs and them being oxidized and that harming us or not?
Yeah, that comes around all the time, that the some people don't think the long chain omega-3s, EPA and DHA, which are even more easily oxidized in a test tube, we're talking about, than ALA. Are they, because they're easily oxidized outside the body, does that mean they're easily oxidized inside the body? And the answer is no, they're not. There's a lot of antioxidant protections built into our system. And the omega-3s, and they don't get oxidized in the capsules either. The capsules completely exclude air, oxygen, which has got to be there to oxidize, obviously. So I think it's an overblown concern about fish oil supplementation, and certainly haven't heard much about an ALA supplementation being a concern, but that's the short answer about that.
I have a question from Nick G on this oxidation point that I also want to kind of brings in another element. He asks, does your test measure whether or not the fish oil is becoming oxidized in the body, leading to poorer health outcomes? He says a lot of people are consuming high doses of fish oil and some are getting benefit and some are not. Very general question.
Very general question. Yeah, I'm not.
It's hard to.
Right. You can't draw from that second sentence. You really can't draw much what a lot of people means and who's getting benefit
Right.
and if they're really taking it or not, and how do you know you're getting benefit or not, et cetera. But no, the omega-3 index test does not measure in any direct way any potential oxidized fatty acids. That would be a very, very different test to actually measure the levels of oxidation products, and they are very low. So I don't worry about that.
Yeah, it's not something to worry about.
So you got another one for me, or I got another one for you?
Oh, you can do another one for me, and then I'll go back to you.
Sandy B is curious about whether omega-3s from a plant source like algae is more beneficial than eating fish, because fish can be contaminated with heavy metals and plastics.
Yeah, good question. This is a pretty individual choice. This is kind of beyond the omega-3 question. So to address the omega-3 question, algal EPA and DHA are created. They're both created in algae, by algae, and then the whole fish chain makes the fish become more concentrated with EPA and DHA. The fish have to eat it just like we have to eat it, and so we are able to have large vats of algae now and create a lot of EPA and DHA. Most of that is being fed to farmed fish, so that they can have somewhat normal levels of EPA and DHA without massive amounts of sea life that needs to be fed to those fish. So that's kind of helps in that area. So the EPA and DHA, the algal sources, are the same thing as what's in fish. It's the same structure and everything like that. It's more expensive typically to have an algal supplement. So that's kind of your limiting factor. It's also typically less concentrated. So you have to take more pills to get the same amount as normal fish oil. And as far as worrying about fish and eating fish, there are about 5 main, very large predatory fish that are typically rich in mercury and not recommended to be consumed for pregnant women. Probably for most people, not good to eat swordfish every night, but you can have it occasionally. And generally, the worry about plastics, or I think it's PCBs, in fish and heavy metals. There are very similar levels of PCBs in many types of meat, like chicken. I think I read they can contribute similar amounts of PCBs to our diet as fish can. So it's just we kind of have a problem overall in the environment, but that's because of the way that we create energy and what we're doing with plastics. And so that's another issue that should be dealt with. But the fish in and of themselves are a really healthful food for most people. And they also have other benefits. There are many studies that show that eating fish regularly, consistently in the diet has really great outcomes for people, as compared. Maybe supplements don't show the same benefits as eating fish. There's definitely in like the pregnancy and childhood literature, there's some of that. And it's, again, fish have a lot more nutrients than just omega-3s. And it is a whole, there are plenty of, like the Mediterranean diet, these larger diets, lots of different foods coming in, but fish is typically an important piece to a lot of these healthful longevity type diets. So There's a lot in there, but
good.
You make your own choices as well.
Yeah.
There's a lot of information out there.